Alright guys, so today's video is all about the Taranis X9Lite S. I've got one fresh out of the box here. I've got the batteries installed, ready to go. We're going to flash OpenTX onto it straight out of the box. Then we're going to update the firmware on the ISRM module. And then we're going to install an R9M Lite Pro and flash the firmware to the module so everything will be latest, greatest, ready to go. The first thing that I did is get a blank SD card, and I'm going to plug that in my computer here. This is the SD card that I'm going to be using in the radio, right in the bottom slot there. So the very first thing we're going to do is I named it X9Lite, so we have that here ready to go. So we're going to go to OpenTX.org, go to OpenTX 2.3.1, scroll down here. So you're going to go right to download the SD card contents. So we're going to go to X9Lite S and the latest version, October 2020. We're going to download that right here. What we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and we're going to extract the SD card contents. So I'm using WinRAR. And we're going to extract it to the SD card that I just put in the computer and named X9Lite. So it's a blank SD card, there's nothing on it. We're just going to extract the SD card contents right to it. So now we're ready to flash OpenTX, but first we're going to go and we're going to grab some firmware files for the M Lite Pro module and for the receivers that I'm going to be using. So I'm going to go to the FreeSky website here, and I'm going to go to the X9Lite S. Then we're going to go to the download section here and go to download page. And we're going to update the firmware for the internal ISRM RF module here. So version 2.1, we're just going to download that. And then we're going to extract this. We're going to go into the SD card. We're going to go to firmware. We're just going to extract it to the firmware folder. That's it. So now we have the internal 2.4 module firmware, so we can flash that. Now we need to grab the R9M Lite Pro module. So we're going to go back to the page here. We're going to go to modules, R9M Lite Pro. We're going to go to the download page. We're going to go to Access Firmware. The latest here is April 2nd, version 1.3. So we're going to download the Access Firmware for the R9M Lite Pro module. This includes F-port, S-bus, everything. It's easy now. Everything is included. You just have to select F-port if you're going to use that in the receiver options. So we're going to download that. And once it's done downloading, we're going to extract that again to the X9Lite's SD card to the firmware folder. Now we have the firmware here for the X9Lite S, the ISRM, and we have the M Lite Pro, FCC. Alright, so that's ready to go, so we can pop this SD card out and put it into the radio. So the SD card's in, we're ready to go. With the radio off, I'm going to plug it into my USB port. Make sure you have the STM drivers ready to go and Impulse RC driver fixer downloaded so that you can put this in the DFU mode. Alright, so we're going to open up OpenTX Companion here. We're going to add a radio profile. We're going to call this the X9 Lite, and then radio type. We're going to go to X9Lite S right here. We're going to choose no heli, Lua, splash screen, add my splash screen here. Mode 2. Alright, so that's all ready to go. Alright, so you go into the downloads buttons here. So it's going to look for the firmware for the X9Lite S, Lua scripts, no heli. So I did check for updates. Now I hit download firmware and I download it to my desktop. So we're going to say OK. Now we're going to connect the radio. We're going to go here to Impulse RC driver fixer, run that. Wow, that took a long time. Okay, so now that we've connected, we're going to go to read write firmware to radio. We're going to load the firmware from the desktop where we saved it. Double check it's the X9Lite S. Write to TX. So now it's flashing the OpenTX firmware to the radio. Once this is finished, we'll be good to go. And we can start setting up our models and flashing the firmware on our ISRM and our R9M Lite Pro. Alright, so the flashing's done. We're going to go ahead, hit close. We can go ahead and unplug our radio. And now we're ready to go into the radio and start setting it up from there. On your radio, navigate to the firmware folder on the SD card. Open the firmware folder and scroll down to your X9Lite S ISRM firmware. Hold the right scroll wheel and select Flash Internal Module. With the internal module successfully flashed and updated, we can now bind and pair any 2.4 access receiver. To set up a model using the internal RF, set the mode on the internal RF to access. Now you're ready to bind and pair using the internal RF module. Make sure you set the failsafe to no pulses. Now we're ready to install the R9M Lite Pro in the external module of the radio. It should slide right in and snap into place. Now that we have the external module installed in the module bay, we're going to go back to the firmwares folder on the SD card, scroll down to the R9M Lite Pro firmware, hold the scroll wheel in, and select Flash External Module. Once the module has been successfully flashed, it's now got the most up-to-date firmware. We can go ahead and bind our R9 receivers. To set up a model using the external module, make sure you turn the internal RF to mode off, so it's not using the internal RF system, and select the internal RF mode, and scroll over to R9M Lite Pro Access. There's a lot of options, so make sure you select the correct one. Now you can go down and set your failsafe to no pulses. Now you can bind and register any R9 receiver, and you're ready to go with this model. So that's all there is to it. This radio now has the internal module and external module updated with the latest firmware. You just have to set up each module to use either the internal or the external module, register and bind your receivers, and you're ready to go and start flying.